Well, thanks very much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to speak on the politics of tax reform in Australia. I must say that whenever I think about this issue, and in particular the political and bureaucratic and other processes that have occurred on this issue over the last 40 years or so, my mind easily drifts to recall Monty Python and the search for the Holy Grail. I guess it's no coincidence that Python and Asprey, I think the first major post-war tax review, were both released in 1975. I'll leave it to you to decide who among the political and other players over this period best encapsulates some of those characters. King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table, Sir Belvedere the Wise, Sir Lancelot the Brave, Sir Robin the not quite so brave as Sir Lancelot, and the aptly named Sir not appearing in this film, and Sir Galahad the Pure. But I think it's instructive to recall a particular section of Scene 3 of Monty Python, where King Arthur is under some pressure to prove his legitimacy to a couple of peasants. And King Arthur says, "I am your king." And the peasant woman says, "I didn't vote for you." King Arthur said, "You don't vote for kings." Peasant woman, "Well, how did you become king then?" King Arthur, "The Lady of the Lake," and then of course there's angelic music playing in the background. The lady of the lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. The singing stops, and that's why I'm your king. Dennis the peasant enters and says, "Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony." King Arthur, "Be quiet." Dennis the peasant, "You can't expect to wield supreme power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you." King Arthur, "Shut up." Dennis the peasant, "I mean, if I went around saying I was emperor just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away." So in the run-up to the Abbott government's promised review of and white paper on the tax system, I think it's important to pose some questions in relation to our past as to how many of our successive Arthurs or Knights since the mid-70s can really claim legitimacy in terms of genuine, appropriate and sustained tax reform, and especially in the light of significant changes in our economic and social and environmental issues over those years and the policy challenges that have accompanied them. So in raising this question, I certainly don't wish to ignore nor deny considerable progress that has been made, although it's been made pretty slowly, in reforming many aspects of our tax and transfer system. But I want to make the point just how compromising the political process has been in terms of trying to make headway in that area. As Ken Henry pointed out in his opening address to the Post-Henry Review Conference in 2010, and I quote, "While Asprey's recommendations received little attention from the Whitlam and Fraser governments, the issues it raised did not disappear. Indeed, the major reforms of the 1980s, capital gains tax, fringe benefits tax, dividend imputation, large cuts to personal and business tax, etc., the taxation of foreign-sourced income in 1990 and the broad-based consumption tax in 1998, were all stimulated by the Asprey Review. They all sought to broaden the base and, to the extent possible, cut statutory rates of tax. Also, as Ken noted, the Asprey report provided more than a series of recommendations. It provided an enduring vision for the tax system design. However, it's important to recognise that Asprey was delivered when the Australian economy was very insular and isolated, was heavily protected and inward-looking and heavily regulated. By the time Asprey was being implemented in the mid-1980s, our place in the world was very different. Most notably, we'd become an open economy with a floating exchange rate. This would certainly have produced different recommendations. I think, for example, the revenue foregone by moving to an imputation system to benefit domestic savers might have been better directed at corporate tax reduction to attract foreign investment. As Henry noted, there were important differences between the Asprey approach and his approach. Asprey first settled the broad outline or vision of the kind of tax system that should be established over time and worked back from that to determine what change would best support that vision. In doing so, Asprey moved beyond the revenue adequacy as the sole motivation of tax policy to what are now the traditional objectives of tax policy of simplicity, efficiency and equity. Henry, in his review, added the principles of sustainability and policy consistency to those traditional objectives. As such, Henry didn't focus on optimal tax system design at all, but rather positioned the tax system, or sought to position the tax and transfer system in the broader public policy context. And as such, he focused on how Australia's tax and transfer system could best meet the nation's objectives and challenges over the next 40 years, arising from the deepening international integration, frequent and rapid technological advances, an ageing population, strong population growth with increasing cultural diversity, deepening stresses between human activities and ecosystems, and pressures affecting housing affordability and urban amenity. I think it's important that you consider essentially then that the Henry Review was a pathway document. While it clearly met all its objectives, there will continue to be extensive debate about the individual recommendations, of course, among academics and policy types and numerous vested interests, recommendation, which, as they're focused on in their detail, I guess. But despite all this, the Henry Review failed to meet the broader political media community expectations. Although it met its objectives, I don't think it was seen to have met the broader political and economic community expectations. Irrespective of what was commissioned and what they actually claimed in their delivery, the expectation was for a tax package, carrying with it the further expectation that the then government would be under pressure to deliver that package. Now, to be fair to Ken, of course, it should be noted that the concept of a package was an unreasonable expectation anyway, in principle, given that he was considering the tax transfer system in isolation from a detailed consideration of government spending trends and commitments. Nevertheless, those expectations were there, and when they were thwarted, of course, it was all too easy to dismiss in the media, for example, for the media to dismiss the document as just another study or review or inquiry, easily essentially shelved by the media, although also too easily cherry-picked with attempts to implement just a handful of its recommendations. However, I think against that background, it should be clear that the government picked a couple of high-profile recommendations immediately, such as the mining tax, and when that backfired, then only did the smaller issues quietly, leaving the bigger issues like savings and state taxes and so on untouched. But I don't think it's widely recognised that the previous government actually progressed some 40 of those recommendations, nearly a third of them. It's also not recognised that the Abbott government has quietly unwound 7 of those 40 without significant public comment linking to the review's recommendations. In my view, the Henry Review should remain a benchmark against which tax proposals and changes are judged, while ever it remains contemporary. Now, as something of a public policy geek, I initially got involved in politics, coming on secondment to be an advisor to the then Treasurer Philip Lynch from the Reserve Bank back in the mid-70s. And then I subsequently, of course, entered politics in the mid-1980s. I did all that in the belief that good policy would prove to be good politics with a fairly short lag. Not only have I had to accept that the lags turned out to be somewhat longer, and I fear are still lengthening as politics has increasingly become little more than a game played out as point scoring in a 24-hour media cycle, but it has been short-term opportunistic populist politics that has essentially prevented most rational policy debate and implementation and delayed the process of much needed reform in the tax and transfer area. Indeed, the history to me of the tax transfer debate since ASPI is littered with examples of where short-term political expediency has delayed or prevented genuine reform. I've already noted the inactivity on ASPI under both Whitlam and Fraser. I remember distinctly being involved in the Fraser cabinet processes in early 1978. Fraser had never felt legitimate after 75, so he'd gone back to an early election to establish his legitimacy and of course had won by an historic margin. We got quite enthusiastic, as did the bureaucratic advisors at the time, and we threw in a whole lot of reform proposals in January 78. And it should be remembered that he had control of both houses of Parliament at the time. What a unique opportunity, a large lower house mandate and control of both houses of Parliament. So part of our reform recommendations were, of course, in relation to tax and transfers, including a broad-based GST. The proposals that went into the cabinet came out faster, I think, than they actually went in. at a time where the government was under really extreme budgetary pressure, although Lynch had the razor gang and cut back what at the time people thought was made alarming cuts in government spending, they still had their backs to the wall in terms of trying to get the fiscal house in order. You would have thought that they would, in that context, at least have looked at tax reform more than they did. But of course, it was thrown out basically in simple terms on the basis of the feared inflationary consequences of a broad-based goods and services tax. I think the particular irony of that is that by the time, that was January 78, by the time you got to the budget in August of that year, the government was forced to adopt a temporary tax surcharge, which they were then forced the following year to make a permanent increase in tax, trying to get the bottom line of the budget in order. The Fraser government also saw the government and the ATO left significantly behind the so-called tax avoidance industry, with new tax schemes emerging almost daily. The most blatant of those was, of course, the bottom of the harbour schemes, which were quite simply raping the business and personal revenue base. Now, this cut both ways, with direct and influential business pressure to lay off on the political leaders, increasingly offset by broader community concern about the conspicuous inequity, as well as some focus on the weaknesses of the system relying on income tax rates, inefficient and complex indirect taxes. But it did lead to a practice of enforcement by press release. The tax authorities and the government were so far behind in identifying these schemes that as they heard of them, they would announce in a press release that they were knocked off, even if it took some months, indeed years, to document the detail of those schemes and try and introduce legislation to do the job. But the inactivity of the Fraser years and the aftermath of that tax avoidance era in the context of a wages accord laid the basis for the Hawke-Keating reforms. The white paper taken to the Hawke Cabinet in '85 argued persuasively that the muddle-through or potholing approaches, as they were called, to tax reform were no longer viable. However, once again, short-term political considerations dominated. Although there was a lot of good work done behind the scenes and in the presentation of the various options, and in particular the development of option C, circumstances, short-term political considerations ran against it. First, the tax summit that was held at that time to consider the white paper ended less than enthusiastically in support of those changes. And secondly, of course, Bob Hawke did his famous backdoor motel room deal with Bill Kelty in the context of the Accord to kill the consumption tax. So basically the bottom line was, as the electorate said at the time, we got the nasties of fringe benefits tax and capital gains tax without the broader-based tax reform. My 1993 fight-back package was similarly very much a victim of short-term politics. I promised significant reform of personal and business taxes with significant reductions in income tax rates, the abolition of several state taxes such as payroll tax and various financial duties, and considerable simplification of the personal tax and indirect tax arrangements, funded by substantial cuts in government spending and the introduction of a broad-based GST. However, Keating ran a very effective scare campaign against that, as we know, and promised to deliver comparable tax cuts. In fact, he legislated to the effect that he could deliver comparable tax cuts without a GST, the so-called LAW tax cuts. I personally found this alarmingly dishonest and galling for Keating to do this, given that I remember distinctly him going into the Parliament after Hawke had rolled him on the '85 tax package, giving a very passionate speech about how he would die fighting for a broad-based consumption tax. His political death had its origins in the early post-93 election admission that he couldn't actually deliver those tax cuts, and that was the beginning of the end of Paul Keating. The introduction of the GST by the Howard government in '98 was also severely constrained by politics. Although the decision to introduce a tax was in response to political pressure, pre-election pressure from the business community for a government to demonstrate its bona fides in matters that were of relevance to business, the government bowed to other political pressures in implementing the tax that severely constrained its effectiveness in both the short and the longer term. Many in the government at the time were quite jolted by the election margin that was so dramatically reduced from 96 to 98, so they sought to minimise the further political difficulties in four respects. First, the decision to commit all GST revenue to the states. It was a clever political move to get the support of the states on side, but it has severely constrained the flexibility of that instrument as a long-term fiscal instrument moving forward, and it ensured from that day that the distribution of those revenues between the states would be a significant growing friction. Second, there was a deal done with the Democrats to exempt certain parts of the GST from coverage. Unfortunately, as long as the GST is not applied uniformly across the board, there will be pressure on government to grant concessions. Indeed, governments of either persuasion are easily duchess to do this. I mean, it doesn't seem to cost very much. They get a good favourable press release, good industry support, but over time they build a problem where the GST revenue is no longer a gross tax. Thirdly, and in political terms, nobody owned the GST at the political level, and this is a very important point, thereby leaving the design and implementation of the system to the Tax Office in conjunction with the Tax Policy Division of Treasury, who took the opportunity, of course, to do some other things, greatly complicating and increasing the cost and implementation of the tax. I mean, the obvious one was my BAS had three lines: how much GST you paid, how much you collected, and what was the difference. The current BAS is a very complicated and compliance expensive exercise which does more than just address the GST in relation to those businesses. Apparently at the time, Treasury also constrained the process by requiring that none of the revenue raised from the GST should be used for personal tax reform. Finally, the strength of the budgetary position at the time gave Howard the political firepower to significantly overcompensate the designated losers from that. So 4 significant points in the design of that system politically which compromise the integrity of the system. And finally, of course, I would say that short-term politics also significantly constrained Ken Henry's review, as well as its implementation, specifically the exclusion of consideration of the GST and tax-free superannuation. Although these two, of course, along with housing, are the principal areas of concession in the existing tax system, the reform of which is fundamental to tax policy objectives of efficiency and equity, and that was a significant constraint. However, to be clear, Ken did actually nevertheless recommend the taxing superannuation earnings and made recommendations in relation to taxing superannuation earnings and retirement. And although my excursion through the tax and reform efforts since ASPI has been brief, should nonetheless serve to make the point that increasingly short-term adversarial politics has at best compromised and at worst wasted the many opportunities that have emerged or been created for genuine reform. Although there has been significant progress in some areas, the bottom line is that we are left with a system that still visibly fails the 3 original key objectives of tax policy, let alone to have adequately adjusted to the dramatic shifts in the global and domestic economic and social environment that the related policy challenges that over that period or are now in prospect. The system has become more complicated, it has become less efficient, and it has become significantly inequitable as essentially the outcome of a series of mostly ad hoc decisions, while sometimes in an attempt at genuine reform, more generally just to raise revenue or to close loopholes or whatever. I go on in the paper, which is available up the front, to go into detail as to documenting the extent of complexity, administrative costs. Our taxpayers are we have the OECD highest level of people relying on tax agents for filing their returns. I go into details of the inefficiency of the tax system, and I document some of the major inequities of the tax system. I won't go through that here. I think there are several pages that are not able to be looked at in terms of time. All I'd say in conclusion of that section is that the need for reform of the tax and transfer system should now be an urgent priority. The likely economic, social and environmental challenges are very real. Specifically, governments face the medium-term challenges of making a transition to a low-debt, low-carbon world, constrained significantly by increasing demand for public services in education, disability, infrastructure and so on, in the context of an ageing population, mounting housing unaffordability, a productivity slump, and in a very competitive global environment where capital is more mobile and our dollar compounds our cost uncompetitiveness. The central question here then is what would be the ingredients for a successful tax reform agenda? How can we best move forward to achieve genuine and sustainable tax transfer reform in what has become an extremely short-term focused adversarial policy and political environment? If governments are left to muddle on, in my view, pretty much as has been in the past, the tax transfer system threatens to become even more dysfunctional. Yet both sides of politics seem to have severely already constrained their options and capacities to respond. And both are opposed to increasing the GST or adjusting the GST, opposed to doing much in terms of the housing concessions. They're opposed to touching superannuation at least for this parliamentary term. These are the three big concession areas, as I mentioned before. But they're also still committed to reducing personal and company tax, even in the face of increasing demands for public services and the major structural policy changes that I listed above. Significant reform will necessarily imply winners and losers, and any reform package will necessitate that some of those losers will need to be compensated. With the current and prospective structural weakness of the budget and the significant spending commitments and expectations that are already being created by both sides of politics, stretching over the next decade or so, whoever is in government is most likely to ever enjoy the budgetary capacity to be able to buy electoral support via heavy compensation for substantial change and reform. In my view, what we do need is a big change. We need a decisive change, what I'd call a big and bold package, calling for some big and decisive new thinking. I'm not going to spell out the detail of what I think here, but a sizable tax mix switch. Surprisingly, with the GST, there hasn't been any significant switch in the tax mix between direct and indirect taxes, but I think a sizable tax mix switch will probably be fundamental, with a move away from corporate taxes to, say, a business spending tax, and an increased GST extended across all expenditure, with expanded land taxes, funding a reform of personal taxation, a reform of the transfer system, and the abolition of a host of most inefficient taxes, mostly state taxes. A big step forward in terms of is a big step forward in terms of simplification, a dramatic improvement in efficiency, a sizeable adjustment to inequality, a new tax or transfer system that clearly recognises the magnitude and significance of the policy challenges ahead for the next decades and puts us in the best situation to handle them. No more muddling through, no more potholing, no more ad hocery. Now, the Abbott government's cast its promised white paper review process in terms of, in quotes, wanting to finish the job that the Henry Review started. Many probably, and mostly the hopeful ones, have interpreted this to mean a desire to mull over and sift through the remaining recommendations of the Henry Review with a view to putting together a reform package that could be taken to the next election, seeking a mandate to make the necessary changes in a second or subsequent term of government. As such, it would fit well with what I believe will be their strategy in the coming May budget, namely not an attempt to return the budget to surplus as soon as possible, but more likely, say, a 10-year strategy to achieve the desired budget surplus of, say, 1% of GDP by about 2023-24. However, is such a process consistent with the likely politics of the period? Even if a viable tax transfer package could be finalised before the next election, how much of it would be compromised as politics unfold? Or to pose the question another way, how can we keep politics essentially out of this process? The experience since ASPI suggests that it's probably not going to be an easy task, although it's worth drawing on that experience to identify the key ingredients for success of a reform process. Let me begin with an ideal world. First and foremost, there's a need for political leadership. Indeed, very strong and persuasive political leadership may be enough in itself to drive through reform. However, what we are really calling for is somebody to own and drive the process, to set the agenda, to control the developments and the explanation, selling of the detail, to challenge others to fall in behind in support, and to manage the delivery. Unfortunately, there are not many examples of this sort of leadership or capacity in our parliaments. However, I guess in recent days, Rudd came pretty close. He came in with a very strong mandate in 2007. He had an enthusiastic commitment, for example, to respond decisively to the challenge of climate change. He was quite explicit about the process and its timing. He'd ratified Kyoto, he'd received the Garneau report, followed by a green paper, white paper. He'd introduced the legislation to Parliament, and if that failed to pass, he'd call a double dissolution to win the right, to force the legislation through the Parliament. He had the mandate, he had the strategy, and he enjoyed widespread community support. All went particularly well until he balked at the last hurdle in early 2010, and of course, the rest is history. The reform and the constituency for that significant policy change was not only lost, but so too was his Prime Ministership. So we do need strong political leadership. Second, a political leader needs other champions to back the cause from academia and from others across the community who aren't just pushing their own vested interests. Third, I think it's important to recognise a significant constraint on building a constituency for reform. Nearly all changes, of course, will have winners and they'll have losers. Yet in our political system, the losers tend to be more influential, more vocal than the winners. Winners tend to be more sceptical. While it should be obvious, the key problem in building a case for tax reform is convincing the potential winners that reform will lead to higher income and higher investment. They know what they've got, and it's difficult for them to accept that they will have more, as well as more opportunities. And there also will be benefits in the form of new jobs that don't exist yet, or new businesses and new investments that don't exist yet. The fourth requirement of successful tax reform is, I think, there's a need for longer-term structural thinking and planning. For governments, this calls for thinking beyond the forward estimates and the next election. For business, it means thinking beyond their existing capital stock. For the unions, it means thinking of working cooperatively to grow the pie before asking for a slice of the pie. The accounting and legal professions and others in the tax industry, it means a significant shift in focus from seeking to profit from complexity, inefficiency and inequity of the system to how to better serve the greater community good. Pretty much, I guess, a suggestion as dentists did in relation to the fluoride debate. And then they all need to work collaboratively to take the broader community along with them. You'd say to me, of course, that's all too much to ask. Short-termism and particularly short-term politics will inevitably win out. Okay, let me go to the other extreme and pose the question as to whether it's inconceivable that an Abbott white paper might consider giving the overwhelming importance of the tax and transfer system to us as an economy and a society moving forward, and the likely fierce negative politics against which or whatever will be proposed, that it would make more sense to consider the establishment of an independent permanent tax commission, an institution designed deliberately to be beyond politics. Given the nature and constraints of our three levels of government, of course, specifically given that any significant tax transfer reform package would need to be based on an agreement between those levels of government, and preferably in the context of reform agreement relating to the spending side as well of our federation, to be then ratified by respective parliaments, the nature and role of such a commission would need to be carefully detailed and carefully negotiated. At one level, it could simply be empowered to provide fiercely independent advice to governments as to the key elements of a reform package based on capacities and funding to seek submissions, commission essential research, etc., sort of a productivity style commission. At the other extreme, it could be truly independent of government, with powers in consultation with governments but only subject to broad parliamentary oversight, to analyse, develop, educate and deliver the reform packages it believes necessary over the next several decades. A Reserve Bank style independent commission. You might say too extreme. Well, I used to sit in the Monetary Policy Committee of Cabinet in the Fraser years, day in, day out. A committee that was dominated by 4 farmers out of 7. So I'd see agrarian considerations determine where our interest rates and exchange rate should be put. That seemed a very far cry in those days for a genuinely independent Reserve Bank with the power and responsibility to set official interest rates and to intervene in exchange markets as they believed necessary. But it did happen. I can remember I wrote a significant academic paper in 1980 arguing the case for an independent Reserve Bank. It was, of course, greeted at the time with some considerable suspicion as to what planet I'd moved to. However, the thinking was consistent with the detailed work of the Campbell inquiry, a fiercely independent inquiry, and a government task force that was set up to handle the implementation of Campbell's recommendations by breaking them into bite-sized chunks for consideration by the Cabinet over time. This was handled in a way that built on a formidable community consultation and education process that built irreversible expectations that in turn ensured that before too long enough deregulation reform would have occurred to virtually guarantee the emergence of a renewed Reserve Bank and a market-determined interest rate and exchange rate, the licensing of a host of new banks and financial institutions, irrespective of whoever or whatever side of politics was in power. A couple of final brief points to consider in pondering the possibility of a tax commission. Is genuine tax and transfer reform too important to be left to politicians? Secondly, are interest rates and/or tax transfers more important to our economy moving forward? Assuming Abbott wants to be remembered for a couple of key achievements in his Prime Ministership, it's hard for me to imagine a more lasting legacy than genuine, innovative tax and transfer reform. To conclude, we need a way to depoliticise politics, depoliticise the issue of tax and transfer reform, short, of course, of hanging around a pond like King Arthur, waiting for some tart to deliver Excalibur. Thank you.